Good morning, class, and welcome to Introduction to Philosophy. In this quick video, I wanted to go through Chapter 1 of The Big Questions by Robert Solomon and Kathleen Higgins, and I wanted to look at a few of the particular questions in the first chapter and look at some of the ways to answer them philosophically, or what they might imply philosophically. And so we're at chapter 1, and I really like this chapter because it provides us with 16 very interesting, very different philosophical questions, but philosophical questions that can relate to each other. And so let's scroll down for a second and we'll come to the actual questions. There's 16 of them. And the first one I'd like to look at is question number 5. The good philosophical questions seem deceivingly simple at first. Let me go ahead and read it. It says, which is most real, and real is in quotes, the chair you are sitting in, the molecules that make up the chair, or the sensation and images you have of the chair you are sitting in? And so it has this trilemma, right? Is it the chair? Is it the concept of the chair that we have through hypothetical deduction in the sciences, such as our concepts of it? Or is it the sensations that we feel about the chair? Now, the helpful thing about this chapter is that if we scroll down past all of the 16 questions, then they will start to analyze each one of the questions in more detail. So we find 5 again. And then we have this paragraph here that gives us a bit more information. And this is a bit more of the philosophical aspect of it. So this part's helpful to pay attention to. Here they say, we tend to think of reality as what is most true, most obvious, most evident to our senses. But sometimes what is evident to our senses turns out to be an illusion, and what is obvious turns out to be untrue. Scientists tell us that our belief that the chair is obviously and evidently a solid object is in fact not correct. Rather, they tell us that the chair is an enormous complex of invisible particles, atoms and molecules, in various arrangements, electrons whizzing around at tremendous speeds, and mostly empty space. On the other hand, a philosopher or psychologist might tell you that what is obvious, so obvious and evident to your senses is not the chair itself, but rather your sensations, particularly those of sight and touch, from which you infer the existence of something causing this sensation of the chair, these sensations. So this number 5, if you choose to do this one, and you can select any one of the 16, and these aren't due until next week, so you can just patiently sort of ponder and reflect on them till then. We've set up this essentially trilemma of what is most real. And at one contender might be the chair itself, which you perceive through the senses, right? So it's the sensation of the chair, which you infer is from the chair, and that is most real. But then we have this more abstract scientific conceptualization of the chair, not as a solid object, which we see through the senses, but as a collection of molecules, as they say. And so if we abstract from that for a second, we're asking, how do we grasp what is most real about this chair? Is it through our senses, or is it through our concepts? And to what extent do those two interact? Now, if we look at the third one for a second, and that's just the sensation, then a difficult, more complex idea arrives. We experience sensations of things in other states of being, such as dreams, for example. We can have the sensation of a chair in a dream, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that chair was real. Perhaps it did. But now we're getting into more philosophical territory. We're having to ask ourselves, how do I judge what is ultimately most real, given these varieties of ways I perceive information? Through the senses, through my mind's representation of what the senses might mean, through the inference that the sensations come from an object in the world, such as in waking life, as opposed to from my mind, such as in a dream. The philosopher René Descartes noted correctly that there is a certain indistinguishability between the sensation in a dream and the sensation in waking life. And therefore, how could we discern the difference between reality and dream? And so all of these philosophical questions begin to come out of this one question about what is most real about this chair. So this is something to ponder. When you're answering this question, don't just say, well, I think the chair I'm sitting on is most real, or I think the molecules are most real, or I think the sensation is most real. But then go a bit further to explore why it is that you find this particular definition or concept of reality more convincing than the other concepts of reality. What makes this more authentic to you? What arguments do you have for that? Let's scroll down to question number 11. And this is also, I think, a fun question. All of them are quite interesting. Okay. Let me go back. This is the analysis of the question. Let's go to the question itself. Question 11. We have developed a machine, a box with some electrodes, and a life support system, which we call the happiness box. If you get in the box, you will experience a powerfully pleasant sensation, which will continue indefinitely with just enough variation to keep you from getting too used to it. We invite you to try it. If you decide to do so, you can get out of the box at any time you want to. But perhaps we should tell you that no one, once they have gotten into the happiness box, has ever wanted to get out of it. After 10 hours or so, we hook up the life support system and the people spend their lifetimes there. Of course, they never do anything else, so their bodies tend to resemble half-filled waterbeds after a few years because of the lack of exercise. But that never bothers them either. Now it's your decision. Would you like to step into the happiness box? Why or why not? And now let's scroll down and look at the analysis real quickly. Now before we get there, I'll just say no one in class has ever said, yes, I want to get into the happiness box. Everyone knows there's something suspicious about it. But just saying no, you don't want to isn't necessarily a philosophical answer. We have to somehow form an argument as to why that would not be the best decision to make. I don't know if anyone's seen the first Matrix too, but there's a scene similar to that where an individual wants to get back into the Matrix, knowing full well the illusory nature of the Matrix itself, but nevertheless wants to get back into it. So here is the analysis if you choose to do the question. It says the point of the question is obvious enough. What do you value? If it is pleasure and contentment, you obviously ought to get in the box. Are pleasure and contentment the same as happiness? That's a philosophical question in and of itself. If, on the other hand, you think life is about relationships with other people, fulfilling ambitions, and doing something, you certainly won't get in the box. But then again, if the reason you like to have friends and lovers is because you enjoy them, then if the reason you like success and accomplishment is because it gives you pleasure, then why not just get in the box? There you'll find genuine enjoyment and pleasure without the hassle of other people, and without having to work, sweat, or worry about the possibility of failure. After all, isn't that really what you want? So this is a second interesting question. And then after we analyze this for a bit, we can kind of see how it relates to the fifth question. And this is another very interesting thing about these questions. They often tend to relate to each other. The first aspect of this question has to do with reductionism, right? If happiness is something that we're often seeking, or ultimately seeking, then why not just experience it directly as opposed to indirectly? So if happiness isn't ultimately what we're seeking, then what is it that we're ultimately seeking? Right? So this is one philosophical question to look at. Also, is pleasure and contentment the same thing as happiness? This is a somewhat difficult philosophical question as well, but we see how quickly all of these philosophical questions arrive from these what might appear to be simple questions. Now, if we look for a moment at similarities between question 5 about what is most real and question 11, we might argue, or could argue, that the sensations are exactly the same, right? The sensations one experiences in the happiness box might be more real or just as real as the sensations one would experience outside of the happiness box. How would we make an argument that those two sensations are qualitatively different? Why is reality outside of the box more real than reality inside of the box? And now we see how we've kind of combined the insights or the dilemmas in these two questions. And it's not entirely clear that the argument is obvious that one is more real than another. It's more just sort of conventions and norms we say to ourselves. We obviously know that reality outside of the box is more real. But again, that's not necessarily a philosophical answer. The philosophical answer seeks justification. We know, but how do we know that we know? That's what the philosopher wants to try to show in their argument. Lastly, if we just sort of change the dynamics a bit and we say, well, let's not focus on happiness, let's just focus on what we want the most. Suppose we enjoy a certain amount of challenge with accomplishment, right? So for example, imagine in the happiness box you're playing sports and you always win, but you're like, oh, this is too easy, right? And you enjoy more of a challenge. You could just imagine a greater challenge in the happiness box. So whatever you think the point of life is, whether it's challenge, moral struggles, pleasure, relationships, success, it could all be maximized to a greater extent in this sort of virtual reality realm of this happiness box. And then we'd come back to the question, well, how is that different? How is that more real or less real than our conventional understanding of reality? So I hope this helps a little bit in exploring how the answers to these questions should be philosophical in nature. Don't just say what you think, right? That's essential. You want to note and write down what you think, but then you want to take the next further steps and sort of explore, why is it that you think that? And if you believe something to be true, don't just say, this is what I think is true, but rather try to justify how you know it is true given other options. And sometimes that can be the most difficult thing initially with the philosophical question, is really taking seriously a variety of other options, such as realities, right? We just assume perhaps that the chair is real, and with good reason, right? We're not doubting the existence of the chair practically. We're just sort of doubting it philosophically so that we can come up with even further justifications for the knowledge. So when you consider whichever question you decide to answer, when you consider your answers to these questions, consider alternatives and then ask yourself, how do I know, or how am I justified in believing my answer to be correct or more correct given this alternative way of looking at it? And that's when you start to present your philosophical justification. So I hope this helps. And again, nothing is due this week, but next week we will be looking at, you'll be answering 2 of these philosophical questions. All right, take care.